His mother-in-law called in early December and said she was expecting them for New Year's. It was 1972 in the stanitsa of Medvedovskaya near Krasnodar, and Victoria, to be honest, did not want to go. But her husband Andrei insisted the grandmother should see her grandsons before the holiday. It was a family duty, everything as it should be. And so, in the final days of December, she packed her things, took both sons, aged 7 and 10, and set off for the village. Her relationship with her mother-in-law was difficult, to put it mildly. Valentina Nabokova was famous for her harsh character. People in the village were afraid of her, and neighbors tried to avoid crossing her. Victoria knew this better than anyone, because she was Andrei's second wife and understood well why his first marriage had collapsed. But now it was a holiday. There were grandchildren. It was expected that they come, and she didn't argue. Andrei helped pack the bags, saw them to the door, and said goodbye, telling them to be careful. Victoria nodded, took her sons by the hands, and left. That same day, she called her husband from the post office in Medvedovskaya, saying they had arrived safely. The mother-in-law had met them, and everything was fine. That was the last time Andrei heard her voice. Valentina Nabokova, 59 years old, had lived in Medvedovskaya all her life, and everyone in the village knew her. She had not accepted her daughter-in-law from the very beginning and didn't even hide it. Victoria was of a different people, an outsider, not the one her son needed. She said this directly, in front of everyone. Andrei tried to smooth things over, but his mother wouldn't listen. Then the grandchildren appeared, 2 boys, and Valentina seemed to soften. She no longer expressed open hostility, began inviting them to visit, and sent gifts. Victoria, however, didn't fully believe it. She remembered too well how her mother-in-law had looked at her in the early years. But for the sake of her sons, for the sake of her husband, she endured, visited, and smiled. Victoria arrived with her sons on December 30th. Her mother-in-law met them calmly, fed them after their journey, and showed them where to sleep. Everything was as usual. Victoria exhaled. It seemed everything would be okay. They were expected back a week later. The holidays were ending. Victoria was supposed to go back to work at the school, and her sons were to return to their desks. But no one returned. Andrei waited 1 day, a second, a third, and there was no news. There was nowhere to call. Mobile communication did not exist then, and one couldn't just run to the village post office. He decided that perhaps they were just delayed. Maybe the sons liked it at their grandmother's, or the roads were snowed in, or something else. A week passed, then a second. Victoria was missing work. The sons were missing school, and no one had warned him or sent any word. Total silence. Victoria's relatives began to worry and started asking Andrei where she was, but he didn't know himself. He didn't understand what was happening. Such silence was completely unlike his wife. She always informed him if something changed in their plans. And so, in January, it became clear that they could wait no longer. Andrei packed his things and went to Medvedovskaya himself to find out what was going on. Valentina opened the door and looked at her son calmly, as if she had been expecting this visit. Andrei immediately asked where Vika was, where the sons were. She shrugged and replied, that they had stayed for only a little while and left. They had headed for Turkmenistan to see Victoria's relatives, saying it was warmer there and they wanted to spend the winter. She said she had walked them to the bus, waved goodbye, and hadn't seen them since. She said this decisively, without a shadow of concern, and didn't even ask in return what had happened or why he was asking at all. Andrei stood on the threshold, unable to comprehend what was happening. Victoria had never mentioned Turkmenistan to him. There were no plans, no conversations on the subject. To leave for months without warning her husband, abandoning her job, it was completely unlike her, unlike anything at all. He asked when they had left. Valentina replied that it was almost immediately after the holidays. He asked why she hadn't called. She shrugged again, as if it weren't her business. The daughter-in-law was an adult and decided for herself. Andrei looked around the yard and the house. Everything seemed normal, nothing strange. Only inside it was empty. No voices of his sons, no belongings. His mother looked at him steadily without expression and simply waited for him to leave. He left, but not for home. Andrei went to the police that same day and filed a report that his wife and sons were missing, that he had last seen them in December, and that his mother-in-law said they had left for Turkmenistan. But he didn't believe it. The officers made an inquiry and contacted Victoria's relatives in Turkmenistan. The answer came quickly. No one had arrived, neither the woman nor the boys. They were neither expected nor seen there. In January 1973, a criminal case was opened regarding the disappearance. They began to investigate. They questioned all the bus drivers who had passed through Medvedovskaya in the early days of January. Routes to Krasnodar, to Timashevsk, to other villages, showing them photographs. No one remembered a woman with 2 boys. There wasn't a single match. They specifically asked if an elderly woman had come to see anyone off, perhaps with bags or suitcases. No. The drivers knew Valentina Nabokova. The village was small, everyone knew everyone. But no one had seen her at the bus station during those days. And it was here that the mother-in-law's version began to crumble. Victoria and her sons had not boarded any bus. No one had seen them off. They had not left. Investigators went through the village, questioning neighbors, acquaintances, and everyone who lived near Nabokova's house. And that's when things began to surface. One neighbor remembered that on the night of December 31st, thick smoke poured from Valentina's chimney, not ordinary stove smoke, but something else, black and heavy, as if something was being burned long and persistently. They kept the fire going for several hours straight, even though the night wasn't that cold. Others heard noise, first loud, sharp arguing, then screams. It was impossible to tell whose, but definitely more than one voice. And then some kind of crash, as if something had fallen. One of the neighbors said it even sounded like someone was banging on something, as if pleading for help. The investigators asked why they hadn't come out, why they hadn't called the police. Silence. And then a Brewster answer. They were afraid. No one wanted to get involved with Baba Valia. It wasn't worth the trouble. Whatever happened, there was a family matter. They would figure it out themselves. They didn't. The investigation reached its first conclusion. Victoria and her sons arrived in Medvedovskaya on December 30th. This was confirmed. They did not leave the village. This was also confirmed. On New Year's Eve, screams were heard in the mother-in-law's house, and strange smoke was seen. The conclusion suggested itself. A search was conducted at Valentina's house. The first theory the investigators worked on was simple and generally typical for such cases. She had killed them and buried them in the cellar. Many did this. It was her own house, her own plot. No one would intrude. The neighbors were afraid, and in winter, even if the ground was frozen, it was still warmer in the cellar, and with enough effort, a hole could be dug. The operatives went down and began to dig. They worked methodically, layer by layer, checking every corner, every section of the floor, tapping the walls in search of hollows, looking for any sign that something had been hidden there. Nothing. No bones, no fragments, no traces of blood on the ground or walls, no characteristic smell of decomposition, even though only a few weeks had passed since the disappearance. The earth was just earth, dense and settled, with no signs that it had been recently disturbed or dug up. They went through the entire cellar to the very foundation, lifting every layer. Empty. The investigators came back up. Valentina watched all of this calmly. She wasn't nervous, didn't ask questions, didn't ask what they were looking for or why. She just stood and waited for them to finish. The cellar theory was not confirmed, but the investigators understood that the bodies had to be somewhere. 3 people cannot disappear without a trace. And so they began to think where else they could look. The next theory they began to work on concerned the garage. A concrete floor. If fresh mortar is poured on top, no one would notice. It would set quickly in winter, making it an ideal place to hide something. They brought tools and began to break it open. Jackhammers crushed the concrete into pieces, revealing the earth beneath, and the operatives dug deeper, half a meter, checking every section, literally centimeter by centimeter, because they understood that if something was there, they couldn't miss it. The work went on for several days in a row. They removed the entire floor, went through the soil beneath it, sifted the earth, searching for anything. And again, nothing. No signs of burial, no disturbed earth, not a single clue that would indicate something had happened here. The concrete turned out to be old, untouched for a long time, and beneath it lay virgin soil that had clearly not been dug in December or in recent years at all. Empty again. Valentina remained silent and behaved as if none of this concerned her. During interrogations, she repeated the same thing. They left for Turkmenistan. I don't know where they are. Look for them there. 2 theories had been checked, and both were failures. The investigation began to stall. A small, silty river with a slow current flowed near the village, and it didn't freeze completely in winter. The investigators realized that if something heavy were thrown in, it would be sucked into the silt, covered up, and would be very difficult to find later. They decided to check it as well. They brought in machinery, divers worked, combing the bottom under the bridge, further downstream, in places where things could be washed ashore. The silty bottom was raised with special equipment. They sifted through everything they managed to bring up. The work went on for several days. The result was the same. Nothing. Not a single find, not a single clue. After that, they combed the forest belts around the village, walked the fields, inspected abandoned buildings, old wells, and pits. 3 people, a woman and her 2 sons, had vanished without a trace. They hadn't left. that had already been established. They hadn't left on foot because someone would have seen them. They weren't hiding with any acquaintances. That had also been checked. And they weren't lying in any of the places where people usually hide things when they want to cover their tracks. The investigation hit a wall. They continued to interrogate Valentina, calling her in again and again. She answered the same way every time. I don't know anything. I didn't see anyone. I walked them to the bus, and that's it. She wasn't nervous, didn't get confused in her testimony, and didn't contradict herself. She carried herself as if all this had nothing to do with her. Valentina was detained and placed in a pre-trial detention center. Interrogations began, long and exhausting, but she held firm. To the direct question of whether she was the one who took their lives, she answered just as steadily, I didn't touch anyone. If you have doubts, find evidence. From the very first days, a lawyer appeared by her side. Where the money for a defender came from was unknown, but the lawyer turned out to be experienced and built a strategy immediately. Stay silent, confess to nothing, explain nothing, do not engage in discussions with investigators. No evidence, no case. Let them search and prove it themselves. And Valentina remained silent. At interrogations, she repeated what she had memorized. In her cell, she spoke to no one. They specifically placed other women with her, so-called plants, whose task was to get her talking, gain her trust, and find out anything, even a small detail. It didn't work. Nabokova held firm as iron. Not a word about that night, not a hint of what had happened in her house on New Year's Eve. The lawyer's strategy worked flawlessly. By September 1973, the case had been stalling for 8 months, and it was a complete dead end. Andrei managed to get a meeting with his mother. He sat across from her in the visiting room, looking into her eyes, while she looked somewhere to the side, past him, as if he weren't even there. He asked directly, Mom, where is Vika? Silence. Where are my sons? What did you do to them? And again, nothing. Not a word, not a movement, as if she didn't hear him at all. He said he knew it was her, that he understood it. Valentina did not deny it. She didn't make excuses. She didn't say the things usually said in such cases, like, how can you think that of your own mother? She just remained silent. Andrei came again and again and again. Each time he asked the same questions, and each time he received the same silence in response. He didn't scream, didn't threaten, didn't try to pressure her. He just asked, already understanding that there would be no answer. Asking because there was nothing else he could do for his family. The investigators observed these meetings and hoped that maybe she would tell her son, that maybe she would waver because he was her own child. She did not waver. Valentina remained silent, as if there were a wall behind that silence. Blank, without a single crack. Then the case was handed over to a new team. Viktor Shugol was appointed senior investigator for the Krasnodar Krai prosecutor's office, and David Goldberg, deputy head of the investigation department, became the head of the investigation. They studied all the materials, everything collected over those months. Search reports, neighbor testimonies, interrogation results. The map marked with where they had searched, what they had checked, where they had gone. The conclusion they reached was discouraging. The bodies would most likely not be found. Valentina had hidden them so well that they couldn't be reached by ordinary methods, or she had destroyed them so thoroughly that searching further was simply pointless. But Schigel and Goldberg made a different decision. If they couldn't find what they were looking for, they would have to prove it without it. They would build a chain of circumstantial evidence so strong that the picture would form by itself, so that everything pointed to one spot, and so the court couldn't brush it aside. It is important to understand that in the USSR, no one had ever done this before. A criminal case for taking a life without the main piece of evidence, without what usually puts an end to such investigations, was a true legal experiment. No precedent existed. No one knew if it would work or not. But there were no other options either, because letting Valentina go meant closing the case forever. And so they started anew, but with a different approach. Not searching for where it was hidden, searching for what remained. Schigel and Goldberg started with the house. A search had already been conducted there, but now they searched differently, not for what is usually sought in such cases, but for traces, any traces that might have remained. They checked every corner, every crack, every object, methodically, centimeter by centimeter, because they understood that if anything remained, it would be hidden so as not to catch the eye. And they found it. Deep under the bed, right against the wall, lay a crumpled fur coat. Nearby stood boots, winter ones, warm, and these were the very items Victoria had worn when she arrived in Medvedovskaya at the end of December. They had been shoved so far back that during the first search they were simply not noticed, or perhaps no one looked closely, because then they were looking for something else entirely. Now they looked differently. A fur coat, boots, the daughter-in-law's winter clothes, and all of it located in the mother-in-law's house. And here a question arose to which Valentina's version had no answer. If Victoria had left for Turkmenistan, why did she leave her winter things behind? It was the end of December, cold, freezing. What did she travel in then? Slippers. And why was the fur coat crumpled and stuffed under the bed, rather than hung in a wardrobe or folded neatly? It was hidden, as if someone didn't want it to be found. The theory of her departure collapsed completely. This was not an accident or forgetfulness. This was a lie. But for the court, this was still not enough. They continued to search further. The yard, the outbuildings, every corner, everything that could provide even the slightest lead. And in the yard, they found an axe. To the eye, it was ordinary, a working tool like those found by the dozen in every household. But one detail immediately stood out. The handle had been recently repainted, a bright blue color, fresh paint, clearly applied over something else. And here the question arose, why paint an axe handle at all? Wood does not rot so quickly as to require urgent painting, and aesthetics for a yard tool is a very strange concern. No one usually bothers with that. The only reason it made sense to repaint the handle was to hide what was on it before. Some kind of stains, marks, something that had soaked into the wood. The axe was seized and sent for forensic examination. The criminalists worked thoroughly, scraping away layers of paint, examining the wood beneath, looking for traces of blood, even minimal, even old ones that could have been preserved in the pores of the wood. The results were ambiguous. They found something, but it was not enough for a categorical conclusion. The paint had done its job and destroyed most of what might have been there. Direct proof was never obtained, but the axe was added to the chain of evidence. The picture was beginning to take shape, still from fragments, but already into something whole. The criminalists continued to work in the house, looking for biological traces, what might have remained on surfaces, in cracks, in places that are difficult to wash completely, even if one tries very hard. And they found it. A fragment of a fingerprint, small, smeared, but still readable, in blood. And most importantly, the size of this print was clearly not an adult's. The print was sent for examination and compared with samples, with the missing person's belongings, with materials from the Krasnodar apartment where Victoria's family lived. The result was unambiguous. The print belonged to one of Valentina's grandsons, her grandson's blood in her own home. And this was not a scratch, not an accidental cut, not a minor domestic mishap that could be explained by childhood carelessness. It was a bloody trace, in a place where it should not have been at all, in a house from which, according to the owner, everyone had left alive and well, boarded a bus, and set off for Turkmenistan. And this changed everything. Now it was not a question of whether they had left or not. Now it was an established fact. Blood had been shed in this house, and it was the blood of one of the missing. The chain was complete. The case went to court. Schigol and Goldberg prepared everything they could. More than 30 expert examinations. Criminalistic, biological, trachological. Every piece of evidence was documented, researched, and confirmed by specialists. Victoria's fur coat and boots hidden under the bed. The axe with the repainted handle. The grandson's bloody fingerprint. Neighbor testimonies about the events of New Year's Eve. Testimonies from bus drivers. The response from Turkmenistan. It was a chain of circumstantial evidence, link by link, and there was not a single piece of direct evidence among them. But together, they formed a picture that could not be explained in any other way than what had happened that night. David Goldberg personally prosecuted the case. The trial lasted several days. Valentina sat in the dock with the same expression she had during the interrogations. Calm, detached, as if all this were not happening to her. Goldberg presented the evidence, piece by piece, examination by examination, and built the entire chain so that each link strengthened the next, so that the picture formed itself. The defense lawyer pressed on one thing. Where is the main proof? If it doesn't exist, then there is no confirmation that anyone was even harmed. Maybe they left. Maybe they are hiding somewhere. Circumstantial evidence is not yet an established fact. The court retired for deliberation. When the judges returned, the room fell silent. Guilty. 15 years of imprisonment. This was the maximum term for a woman under the legislation of the USSR. They simply could not give more, even given the severity of what she had committed. Valentina listened to the verdict in silence. She did not flinch, did not lower her eyes, and showed no reaction at all. She simply nodded to the guards and stood up. The defense filed an appeal, and the Supreme Court of the RSFSR reviewed the case but left the sentence unchanged. Nabokova was transported to a penal colony. Only after the verdict did Andrei tell investigators what he had been silent about before, something he himself had long not wanted to remember and had tried to keep deep inside. Victoria was his second wife. He had also come to his mother with his first wife a long time ago, when he was still very young. He brought his wife and newborn daughter then, wanting to show the granddaughter to the grandmother, as usually happens in families. The baby cried a lot, as all infants do at that age. But it irritated Valentina, and she did not hide her dissatisfaction, saying there was noise from her, that she was in the way, giving no peace. And then, one morning, the young parents found their daughter in her crib. She was not breathing. Doctors arrived and determined it was suffocation. André did not believe his wife then. How could one think such a thing of one's own mother? The family fell apart after that. And now, after everything that had happened, he remembered that story and finally realized that his first wife might have been right. Investigators began to dig deeper, bringing up old cases and checking Valentina's past. It turned out that she had been under suspicion before. Her 5-year-old nephew died under mysterious circumstances, then an elderly relative. And each time it was the same. Nothing was proven, the cases were closed, and she remained in the clear. Valentina Nabokova served her sentence in full, all 15 years, from the first day to the last. She was released in the late 80s, old but not broken, and returned to Medvedovskaya, to the very house where it all happened. Neighbors saw her on the street, and they say she looked just as she had before, silent, heavy, with that same gaze from which one wanted to turn away. A year later, she passed away. She never uttered a single word about what happened. Not at the trial, not in the colony, not after her release. What occurred on New Year's Eve, 1972, stayed with her, and she took that secret with her. Victoria and her sons have not been found to this day. More than 50 years have passed, and in all that time, neither bones, nor fragments, nor traces of a burial have been discovered. 3 people disappeared, and the earth has not given them back. What remains of this story? A fur coat and boots hidden under a bed, an axe with a repainted handle, a bloody fingerprint. That is all that remains of the family that came to their grandmothers for the new year. The house in Medvedovskaya still stands, and the secret remains as well.